and welcome to this video tutorial. In this tutorial we are going to discuss about the introduction to web services. My name is Nebojša Bačanin-Đakula, PhD. I am professor at Singidunum University, Faculty of Informatics and Computing. This video material is not for commercial purposes. This video is intended only for the students of Singidunum University. Now let's get started. So let's begin our discussion with the definition of a web service. On the internet, as on many other sources, we can find the definition that the web service is a service which is delivered over the web. But there are many problems with this definition. First of all, this is not a complete definition. So let's ask, is a regular web application a web service? This application delivers a service over the web. Regular web applications just deliver output via HTML code. But HTML, Hypertext Markup Language, is not designed for app-to-app interaction. And web services do app-to-app interaction. So, definitely, a definition that states that a web service is a service which is delivered over the web is incomplete. So, when we look at the standard web application, this application usually consists of three layers. First we have a web layer or presentation layer, then we have so-called business logic layer, and finally we have the bottom layer, which is called the data or data access layer or data persistency layer or similar. So we have here this data layer. So what is the problem with this app? This is a standard web application, and this application is delivering service over the web. So web service needs to connect one application to another. So in this case, what will happen if we want to connect this application to another application that resides on the other machine? Okay, we can do it. There are ways so we can do it. So we can do something like that. We can, for example, take this business layer and data layer and create a jar file for this. So we create a jar. And then we move this jar file to another machine. Let's say it's machine 2. Okay, so that's good. So we implement this jar file, install all dependencies, configure the environment. So we have this application here. But the process of jar creation is complicated. And also, for example, if something changes here in business or data layer in the source application, we would have to create another jar and to move it to another application. Oh, that would be really complicated. So this is not a proper way to do it. So we need a solution where one application is able to provide with the output that other application can understand. And if we provide this, we solve this problem. So standard applications have output via HTML code. This is something what humans can understand. But if this application, for example here, this application can provide output that other machine can understand, we solve the problem. And that's exactly where web services come into the play. So this would be an example of the web services. For example, if we have one app called, let me say, app A here, and we have something like to-do service. Service here. If this app requests something, this to-do service would provide app A with an answer or response in the format that app A can understand. So this is just the basic concept of a web service. According to the W3C, World Wide Web Consortium definition, web service is a software system designed to support interoperable machine-to-machine interaction over the network. So from this W3C definition, we can distinguish three basic properties that each web service needs to have. First, web services need to be interoperable. So interoperable. Secondly, web services need to provide machine-to-machine interaction. And finally, web services should deliver their services over the network. So, if web application has these three properties, this application can be considered to be a web service. But what does all of it mean? First, standard applications are designed for human interactions via graphical or console user interface or in some other way. Web services are designed for app-to-app interaction or machine-to-machine interaction. So, app that is a web service must be able to communicate using standard formats to the other machine. Then, application that is a web service must be interoperable. So this means that every kind of application must be able to communicate with the web service. So maybe this application A is written in .NET or in Java or in some other language or technology. It doesn't matter. This app can be written in any language or technology, and this app should be able to communicate with this to-do service, in this case, which is a web service. So that means interoperable. With this property, web services can connect with many different and various types of applications. And finally, third feature that each application that can be defined as a web service needs to have is that it supports communication over the network. So this third feature is also essential so the application can be defined as a web service. So when you have one application, and if you want to examine whether this application is a web service or not, try to define these three characteristics of web application. If the application satisfies and has all three characteristics, then this application is a web service. So now let's continue our discussion about the basic concepts of web services. Again, I'm going to write something like this. We have, for example, app1, again, app1, and we have a web service here. Okay, here is a web service. Okay, so we have that an app I is consuming a web service, and the app A needs to send some input to the web service, and the web service needs to send output back to the application. Input to this web service is called request. And then, of course, when web service sends data back, this is output from the web service, which is called a response. Response. So, for example, app A first creates a request that wants to know what is the current price of the, for example, QSP or BCD cryptocurrency. Web service then processes this request and sends the response back to the application A with an answer. So web services create responses and send responses back to the application that requested some information. But now we pose some questions. So how the data exchange between applications, in this case app A and web service, takes place? So everything needs to be platform independent, as we said earlier. So this app A can be written in Java, can be written in .NET, can be written in PHP, it doesn't matter. It still needs to communicate with the web service, and they should use the universal language for this, language that is not platform specific. So again, this is the feature of interoperability. So requests and responses should also be in the platform independent formats. So for this we need to use some universal language, and in most cases for requests and responses we use XML, extensible markup language format, or JSON formats. JSON, JavaScript object notation. JSON is supported by a wide variety of front-end and back-end systems. So, in order to make a platform-independent communication or to create interoperability between app A and web service, we need to use universal format of requests and responses, and in most cases this is XML and JSON. But now we have a second question. How does application A knows a format of request and response? How does this application knows what kind of request and response format a web service can read and can answer to? For these purposes, every web service offers something called a service definition. Service definition. Service definition is provided by a web service, and it tells the application, in this case application A, that wants to consume this web service, it tells it the following. First, request response format. Secondly, it tells it request structure. So how is the request structured? It tells it response structure. And finally, service definition tells the application endpoint. Okay, so the structure of request response is simply how should application A create request and response. A request response format is whether the web service is using XML, for example, or JSON format. And endpoint is how to call the web service. What is endpoint and where is the web service available? So with endpoint, the web service tells the application where is the web service available, on which location, on which usually URL the web service exposes its services to the application. And now let's just briefly summary the important concepts of a web service. So first, we have something called request. Request is input to the web service, logically. Then we have something called response. Response is the output from the web service. Then we have something called message exchange format. Message exchange format is the format of requests and responses, and usually, as we mentioned, it's in the XML or JSON formats. Then we have something called service consumer. Service consumer is application, in this case application A that wants to consume or to use a web service. Then we have a service provider. A service provider, that's application, that's the web service that provides some kind of service to the application. So also we said that all this has to be platform independent, and this interoperability is achieved by using standard formats like XML or JSON. Then we mentioned service definition. So service definition is the contract between service provider and the service consumer, and as mentioned before, this service definition defines the formats request and response structure, and the endpoint. Endpoint defines what URL the web service exposes. So endpoint defines which URL should the application go in order to consume the web service. And there is only one thing that we did not mention before. We also have one term which is called a transport. So transport defines how a web service is called. It defines, for example, is a service exposed over the internet or over the queues. So internet or queues. So if the web service is exposed over the internet, we are using something called HTTP. It's Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It's like we are browsing websites. We enter the URL and then the web service is called. And if we are using queues, we have something called MQ, message queue, and this is a transport model that is used for communication over a queue. If we use HTTP, I think everything is clear and straightforward, but if we are using queues, the communication executes in the following way. Service consumer will place a message on the queue. Then service provider will take this message from the queue and will process this message. When the processing of this message by the service provider is finished, then the provider will put the message back on the queue and send it to the consumer. And that's it. We can also, for this MQ, create a simple picture. For example, we have a service consumer, and here we have a service provider. And down there we have something called MQ, message queue. It's usually called the WebSphere message queue. So first, service consumer puts a message on the queue and sends this message to the service provider. Service provider then takes this message from the queue, it processes this message, and then sends answer back to the queue and over the MQ transport to the service consumer. And finally, the service consumer reads response and consumes it. So, it is important to understand that this transport defines whether the web service is exposed over the queue or over the internet. So, if it is exposed over the internet, we use HTTP for communication, for the transport, or if it is exposed over the queue, we use message queues for the transport. So that would be all for this video. This was just a basic introduction of the most important concepts of the web services. Thanks everybody for listening and see you soon.